I'm Darrell Bock, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement at Dallas Theological Seminary, and we're here to have a conversation about Christianity in the public square and how to have those conversations.
I'm John Lennox. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Mathematics here at the University of Oxford, but I've been involved in the public engagement in defending Christianity around the world for many years.
And John and I have spent a little bit of the day together, and it's been very good to get to know you and to interact. And as we have talked about the things that we share in our ministries of public engagement in one way or another. So it's been a joy to be with you today. And I think I want to start by asking a question that we were discussing earlier together, and that is, what is it that's important in thinking about what principles should we bring when we engage in public about our Christian beliefs?
Well, I've enjoyed the day very much as well, Darrell, meeting you essentially for the first time and finding such a lot of common ground. I suppose the first thing I would say is when we engage in public, we're facing a barrage of questions, either spoken or unspoken. And my first attitude is we need to take people's questions seriously. But not only that, we take the questioners seriously. And perhaps because I'm so embedded here in Oxford, I believe in the good old-fashioned Socratic method, that is asking questions. So I like to try to get to know people that I'm conversing with, especially if they don't share my worldview, my Christian worldview, and ask them questions and get to know them that way.
Yes, I'm very much similar. I say when you're meeting someone and talking about the faith, you want to get a spiritual GPS reading on them, which is understanding their whys and wherefores. And you put your Christian meter on mute. Just mute it and listen for their whys and wherefores, how they put their life together, what they think drives life, etc. And what you're looking for are those values that you may share with them, but they take in one direction and you may take in another, and it opens up a place to have a conversation in which there's something shared between you.
Yes, because there's a real danger, sadly, on the part of some Christians of coming across as superior, as if we got all the answers to every question. And I want to come at it the other way and look at each man and woman quite independently of their worldview as of infinite value, made in the image of God. And I try to treat them as such, as human beings, as people with questions and people with their own answers. And we can only have a profitable conversations if we, as you say, and I like the metaphor, take a GPS reading.
And I think the value of that is it communicates a respect for the person, because all difficult conversations have a variety of elements in play. I tell people when I'm in a difficult conversation, there are three things happening simultaneously. So it's like a broadcast happening on three channels. There's what you're talking about, there's the lens through which you see that subject, and then there is the identity issues that you tie to what it is that you're talking about. And it's really those latter two that are driving the conversation, even though you think you're talking about the top level thing, the topic alone. No, it's those other things that are the conversation drivers that you need to pay attention to and look for as you're having the conversation.
People are very sensitive with their antennae if they sense they're not appreciated or not being taken seriously. So I think that's ground zero for all public engagement, that the public as well see that we take our opponent, if they're in that category, very seriously, and also that we take their questions seriously before we engage them.
And when you learn to do that, the other thing that you do is you create a tone for the conversation, which, when it becomes your turn to speak, gives you the same amount of space to share what you're going to share as well, and it opens up the door for a better conversation.
Absolutely. You're not trying to win an argument. In that sense, my view is you try and befriend a person. And I mean befriend, not just communicate to them, but show them that you're open to friendship and to developing it. It can be difficult to do that in public, but I think it's certainly worth trying.
Yeah, I'm very much the same mindset where there's the content of what you're talking about, and then there's what's happening relationally between you and the person you're interacting with. And I want to communicate a care at a relational level, even in the midst of what may be a disagreement at the content level.
Yes, now there are different formats of public engagement. Of course, one of them is just a straight lecture, but the other is where you have ideally not more than one person who takes a different worldview. So you're given the opportunity to say things, they're given the opportunity to say things, and you have to rely very much on a moderator to keep the thing going. And I think there, one of the really important things is this, that you do not allow the other person to set the entire agenda. That's always the risk, particularly in confrontational debate, which I'm delighted to say is dying. I have debated a lot in that way with atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Peter Singer and so on. But I find now even the atheists don't like it, because it really tempts people to cut corners by just trying to win an argument, and therefore entering emotionally and trying to sway the vote rather than communicating the facts and ideas that you want to do. And I think we need to avoid that like the plague.
I think the hard part of this kind of conversation and setup is when it becomes a debate, obviously people walk in already having a side and having a particular approach. So I find myself having to remember that when I'm in this conversation with someone who's been purposely positioned to be different than I am in terms of how they approach things, to say, my goal may not be to persuade the person who's sitting in the chair opposite me, but I've got an audience out there trying to decide where they land between us, and they're in many ways more my primary audience than the person I'm having the conversation with.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I remember having some very good advice from one of the leading journalists here just before I debated with the late Christopher Hitchens. And I said, have you anything to say to me? He said, plenty, because I know Christopher. And he said, first of all, don't try to outsmart him because you lose. But secondly, make sure he doesn't set the agenda. And try to set in your mind that by the time you've finished, you have presented to the audience out there beyond him what you really believe. Otherwise, they'll not know what it is they have to decide about.
Exactly.
And I found that excellent advice.
Let's deal with another facet that often happens when you engage in a public conversational situation or maybe a public debate. There usually is a question time that comes afterwards. I think that's what you all
Q&A.
You call Q&A. We actually call it Q&A. We less likely to call it question time, but we do speak the same language. So when you get questions, you have a particular strategy that you shared with me that I thought was pretty interesting about how you deal with questions that are coming at you, not dealing with them one at a time, which I thought was fascinating. So can you explain how you deal with questions?
Well, it's kind of you to say it's my strategy, but actually I learned it from a friend in Germany. And when I saw him do it, I immediately saw its advantage. The basic idea behind it is to collect several questions before you answer any of them. And that has the following effect. In most audiences, you have a dominant questioner who'll be at the microphone immediately. Now, they often have a very genuine question, but they'll stand at the microphone, they'll ask their questions, and they'll keep standing there while you answer it. And if they're not happy with it, they'll then ask you a second question, at which point you begin to lose the rest of the audience. And this friend of mine said, the first questions that asks, if you deal with it that way, will dominate all the rest of the conversation. So what he taught me to do, and I've practiced it ever since, is to collect 4 or 5 questions and write them down. So if the dominant questioner appears first, I just say, well, what's your question? And I write it down. And then I say, thank you, second question. And that takes all the potential heat out of it. They can't dominate, they have to go and sit down. And it means now that the audience is beginning to get an idea of the different questions in the room. So I'll keep doing that for 4 or 5 minutes, write down 4 or 5 questions. And as I write them down, I'm noting the type of questions they are. And I will order them informally, but I look for questions that give me an opportunity to explain what I believe the Christian message is to be. Some of them might be technical questions, for example, in my case on science and so on. So I look for those things that enable me to go beyond and actually communicate the Christian message. And then when I come to answering them, I'll say, right, that's enough. Now let me look at them, and I will arrange them in an order so that I can extend them. And that is the effect of showing the audience that actually there's a lot of meat in these questions. And so I'll move through, and if I deal with them fairly rapidly, I'll then ask for a second round. And I found that to be extremely effective.
Yeah, because it allows you to actually, if there is a relationship between the questions, almost tell a story while you're answering the question.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And we can tell that story and also admit, if I don't know the answer to the question, I'll say so, because I meet many people who are afraid, even high-powered academics, they're afraid of being caught out by a question. Now, this method means that if a question comes in, you haven't a clue what it's about, you can still write it down, and you've got thinking time. And that's very important, so that you can then say to the person, honestly, look, I hadn't heard of this before, but let me explore it with you. And then they learn something else about you, that you're not claiming to know everything. And that's hugely important, because sometimes, sadly, people have the impression that Christians claim to know answers to every question. We don't. We're just human beings, and we're engaged on a journey like they are.
So one issue that tends to come up is the idea of taking a person's question sincerely, with sincerity. And I think what some people would say is, well, how can I take a question to be sincere when I think it's coming from a potentially destructive or problematic place? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, you can't judge the answer to that without getting to know the person. And I see that public engagement is one side, but private engagement like this is slightly different. And on the personal level, I first want to do your GPS research and find out where they're coming from. And the way I do that, and I've got a little rule, and because I'm Irish, I tend to break it. And that is, when I meet somebody new, I keep asking them questions until they ask me one. Because I mean just ordinary questions, not questions about philosophy or Christianity, but questions about what motivates them and all this kind of thing. And it's that enables you to get to know them, something about their family or something about an experience they've had that has really affected them deeply. And once you can get those emotional and personal and social dimensions out into the open, the conversation then tends to go a great deal deeper, and you find out just how disturbed the background is, and we're all disturbed in a way, and find out where we can share through experiences we've had. And it's important to be very honest about those.
Yes, and I've got two directions I want to go, so let me sort them out. On the one hand, it seems to me that, and this is a distinction that I like to make when I'm having difficult conversations, and it goes something like this. It's one thing to understand somebody, it's another thing to assess that understanding. And so, and my first goal in being a good listener is to first understand the conversation we are actually having before I jump to assessment. I'm a little afraid that sometimes, because we tend to come into conversations with an agenda, we push the assessment button and not make the effort to really understand where the person is coming from.
It's a fundamental and very serious mistake in my view. And you find it made by various leaders in the Bible. They thought that because they could analyze the situation, they knew the solution to it. And just understanding it doesn't necessarily give you a solution. And often you have to explore that very carefully with the person themselves and step by step bring certain biblical principles, if you can, into that conversation.
So you've added a new thing on the table, so I'm going to go there because this is great. And that is, when you are pursuing understanding, it's one thing to pursue understanding, and the assessment conversation is actually in some ways a different conversation. So it's conceivable that I may understand an area very similarly to the person who has a different worldview, but the solution that we apply to that problem may end up, in fact, it likely is going to be very different.
Correct.
And that's where your conversation ends up being more confrontational. But if you skip the understanding step and go directly to assessment, you're going to miss the things that you actually share as you're talking about a solution, which is not the right way to have a conversation.
No, it isn't. And I'm going to put in an oblique point here.
Okay.
It seems to me sometimes Christians get so uptight inside with their agenda that they want to get across in a personal conversation that they come across very false. They change their voice. It's quite remarkable. And they just scare people to death. And also there is a danger of being a monomaniac. In other words, only being able to talk about, quotes, spiritual issues. And I make a little rule for myself, and again, it's difficult to keep, but it's this: I should be the first person to change the conversation. If I sense the person with whom I'm speaking is feeling pushed into a corner, I should change the topic. Now, often they'll accept that and breathe a sigh of relief, or else they'll say, no, I want to pursue this. Well, that's fine. They've given you permission to pursue it. But in personal dynamics, it seems to me those things are extremely important, because we get nowhere if people feel threatened.
Now, everything about what we've said has had this emphasis on the relational dimension of what's going on in the midst of the content. Let me go to one more place, and it's this. When we have a public conversation, so I'm sitting opposite someone who doesn't agree with me, what I don't realize is that I'm actually having a multiplicity of private conversations at the same time.
Correct.
That everyone is processing what I'm saying and what this other person is saying, and they're taking it through their own experience and where they are, which means that I can't entirely lose my one-to-one, face-to-face skills, if I can say it that way, or approach, even if I'm in a very public forum.
I'll go even further than that.
Okay.
And I will say that if I'm not constantly engaging one-on-one, I will lose public authority and communicative skills. The one-on-one relationship, and you can see in the Gospels how much Jesus did one-on-one or small groups, feeds the public thing. So you're completely right, seriously right, that you're actually, there are maybe 1,000 people out there in the audience, and they're each having a conversation with you. Now that's difficult stuff.
It's like overwhelming.
It is overwhelming. Yeah. But we've got to face it. If God has chosen this way of communication, at least it makes us humble enough to trust Him for the outcome.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I think that those are some of the more subtle features, I think, of public engagement, but they're actually quite important, because they communicate of the most important value perhaps we've been communicating, which is beyond the content. Or let me say it this way. You can be right about the content, but if you're wrong relationally, you're still wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's a bad place to land. So what you want to do is you want to be good about the content on the one hand, you want to be caring about the person's sincerity on the other, and you want to be relationally strong so that in the mix there's a sense of, this is a person, and I'm talking about myself or you, and we're engaging, this is a person who I sense really does care about me even though they don't agree with me.
That's right. And the proof of it all is that you can go and have a meal and chat to them afterwards.
Exactly right. So let me shift gears a little bit and think about what happens when you've got a worldview challenge conversation like the ones that we're talking about. And oftentimes Christians will view that through the cultural war lens.
Yes.
You know, they will say, my goal is to defeat you in argument so that everyone becomes convinced that the way I see things is the way everyone should see things, which of course is a very high standard to begin with and probably not entirely achievable on the other, but nonetheless, it's often the way it's seen. And so the person is seen and sometimes even treated like an enemy to be crushed.
Yes.
And one of the things that we talk about when we do our cultural engagement is to say that's probably the wrong way to view it because of a text like Ephesians 6, which says, Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the cosmic forces in the heavenlies. And I like to tease people about the Greek. It's the word cosmocrat. And I say, if you think a bureaucrat is bad, you should meet a cosmocrat. And in the midst of thinking about this, it is the idea that there's a spiritual battle going on, and the armor, this is the armor of God passage, where all the armor is not my ideology. It's actually elements of the virtues of our faith, like righteousness and the peace of the gospel and prayer and the teaching of Scripture, etc. So we're fighting in this way. So I say, if you need a military metaphor, the metaphor, rather than saying I'm there to crush the ideas of the person sitting across from me, it's to recognize we're in a spiritual battle in which they've been captured by a set of ideas, only they don't even realize they're in danger. So I'm more like a special forces person trying to run in and help someone and rescue them and serve them, only they don't even realize they're in danger. I think that brings a different tone to the way we engage. What do you think of that way of thinking about Ephesians 6?
I think tone is all important. You mentioned earlier respect, and that should come across to people, that we're actually interested in them. Secondly, you used the term worldview, which I think is crucial. And sometimes I find myself in a discussion where they think I have a worldview which I believe, but they don't have a worldview. They're scientists. They don't believe anything. They don't have any faith. And I want to gently point out that that's totally false. Every one of us has a worldview that we believe. And therefore, we can start teasing out the differences between our worldviews and to try to get across. And I like your metaphor because people do not realize that sometimes they've imprisoned themselves in a castle which they themselves have created. Particularly in the field of science and religion, scientism, science is the only way to truth. Well, there are ways of dealing with that are gentle, but are very clear. And if you can get people to see that they are imprisoned by ideas, by also admitting that you yourself could be biased. And of course, we're all biased. I often say to people, I'm prejudiced. But I hope that what is prejudiced to me is good stuff. So we can compare notes, so to speak. But you also mentioned, and with this I'll finish this point, the Christian virtues. Now, those are the things that should be coming across in any engagement, that the audience can see, and that's very important, not only the person you're engaging with, but the audience can see that this is a chap who's not full of his own ego, who's prepared to learn, who's humble, who's respectful, and above all, who listens. Because sadly, sometimes we are so impassioned with the message we have to deliver, and some are taught that way, that we don't listen. And I was taught as a child that I've got 2 ears and 1 mouth and I should use them in that proportion.
You remind me of the passage in James that says that we should be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God.
But that's so true. Once we get angry, we've lost it. Now, I don't mind my opponent getting angry. And that's often happened, I'm afraid. And audiences see it. They pick it up immediately. And you can see that the other person has lost the plot, but they can't see it.
So here's the last point that I want to raise, and it goes something like this. That we actually shouldn't be surprised about the kinds of conversations that we're in, because in the Christian faith, we believe that a human being is defined by being made in the image of God. But if someone doesn't have a view of God, then what we're saying to them is, you are made in the image of, it's a blank for them.
Yes.
You're trying to create a category in one sense that they currently don't have. And so it's not surprising that if they don't have anything to go in the who I am slot, that I'm made in the image of God, that they will create the sense of image and identity that they have for themselves in order to make sense out of their life. That should never surprise us, right?
Absolutely right. But it should give us leverage, actually, because I believe one of the most important things we've got to say is precisely the fact that there is a creator who has created us in his image. I was listening to Jordan Peterson the other day. He gives lectures on Genesis, and he came across this verse. And God created men and women in his own image and so on. And he stops when he's talking about it. He said, man, that's the foundation of all our ethics and values. And we ignore it at our peril. Now, we talked somewhere along the line in this about getting across to the other person that they're valued by us. But there's an even bigger thing, that from where we sit, they are of infinite value because they're made in the image of God, and that's the reason we take them seriously. Now, it's very hard for people to argue against that sort of valuation, and I often find the question session, that then becomes a stepping stone to the even greater valuation in that Christ died for them. But that tends to come later. I tend to find that, Darrell, that it's in the question session that I get beyond the concept of being made in the image of God down to the specific content of the Christian message.
And for me, what I see is when I look at this, I think we have, life in one sense is about having a sense of your location. And if you are not connected to the one who made us, okay, that's pretty dislocating.
Sure is.
And so in the midst of thinking about that, what gives us value is the fact that we do have value even to the one who made us, even to the one who made the world that we're in, the creation that we're a part of, etc. And so you end up promoting who the person is as opposed to demoting them or anything, or making them meaningless, which are probably your only other options if you aren't connected to a creator God.
And that's also in my field of science and philosophy, that's often an area where we can go, and that is to show that alternative philosophies actually devalue human beings, and they end up being a nothing. And we come to the situation where, as scientists, we know how everything works, but we know the value and meaning of absolutely nothing, as I think Owen Barfield once pointed out. And people are desperately searching for meaning. And I find people will listen to that if it's put across in a friendly, non-threatening way.
And if you listen to the language of people who are trying to find them, I'm trying to find myself.
Yes.
That kind of thing. That tells you there's a sense of dislocation that they already have that they're trying to figure out. And so they're already there. Here's one last point that I want to make about this particular question, because I think it's important. And that is, when you look at the creation mandate that we've been given in Genesis 1:26 to 28, and the discussion is we're made male and female, and the woman was placed alongside the man, and they were, be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. There's a stewardship responsibility that we've been given before God. We're supposed to manage the creation well. I often say we don't have a good theology of stewardship, of management, and thinking about who we are as human beings. And we need that in order to make sense of who we are, what we're usually about from day to day, etc. That seems to me to be a missing piece in the development of thinking about not just who we are as human beings, but also about the gospel, that the gospel is rooted in taking us back to realize who we were made to be and who God can make us be in light of a world that's become messy and dysfunctional.
It's seriously important, actually, when people are talking about what we've done to wreck the planet, climate change, all this kind of thing. It's seriously important to point out that God is on their side in terms of their critique, that we're meant to be stewards, not exploiters, ruining his creation. And the tragedy is we're not only ruining the physical creation, we're ruining ourselves because we've lost that connection with him. I agree with you entirely, and I think it's a very useful bridge to go into people's minds. And perhaps that's a point with which we could end, that what I feel I'm trying to do all the time is to build a bridge to the other person. You started off, Darrell, by saying you look for common ground. I look for it all the time. And sometimes people will say, I agree with that. And then you can go from there. Because after all, we should expect that. Because if we are all made in the image of God, we're made in the image of God as moral beings. So we all should have a sense of the rightness and wrongness of things. Now that gets distorted, but very often in discussions I find people almost spontaneously and in spite of themselves agree and say that makes sense to me. We can build on that kind of thing.
Well, it is a great place to end. Again, it's been a real pleasure to meet you today and to interact on this and to show that having just met each other, how much we actually share as we think about what ministry is in the public square. So thank you, John.
We should do this again. Thank you, Darrell.
You're very welcome.
Hey guys, how you doing? My name's Nathaniel and I'm part of the Ocker team. And I just wanted to say a big thank you for watching this film we made. At Ocker, we really love to speak about the big questions of our time and to show how the Christian faith provides credible and valuable answers. If you've enjoyed this film, check out the other stuff on our channel, and also please consider subscribing and following us. It really helps to make more films like this. We also want to hear from you, so if you have any ideas for new content, please put them in the comments below or get in touch with us directly. Thanks goes out to all the speakers, donors, and film team, of which I'm a part of. And actually, fun fact, it takes around 60 hours to make all of these films. And that's because we want to make sure the content is incredibly well researched, it looks and it flows beautifully, and ultimately, that it's actually useful to you. So this means a lot of research, listening to our audience, and filmmaking. Our incredible staff at Ocker who make these films are funded by donations. So if you want to partner with us with our work, please also consider donating, which is really easy on our website. See you next time.